Before the documentary begins, I would like to brief in a few lines first on the title Mali Empire, the Lost Gold of Africa's Forgotten Kingdom. The desert wind howls across the ruins. Once, this land glittered with gold, a kingdom so wealthy that it stunned the world. Travelers spoke of streets paved with gold dust, of palaces that shimmered beneath the blazing African sun, and of a king whose generosity changed economies. But now, silence, no gold, no glory, only sand swallowing history whole. What happened to the empire that possessed more wealth than Europe itself? What led the richest civilization in human history to vanish, without leaving a trace of its golden crown? This is the untold story of the Mali Empire, a story of brilliance, betrayal, and a disappearance that defies explanation. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Join us as we uncover the secrets of forgotten empires, one lost civilization at a time. Let us begin the complete documentary on the title, Mali Empire, the Lost Gold of Africa's Forgotten Kingdom. Thus, beginning of the Mali Empire is a story that rises from silence, a tale born in the dusty heart of West Africa, where the harsh winds of the Sahara met the fertile lands of the Niger River. In that crossroads between desert and life, tribes lived fragmented, scattered, and in constant struggle for survival. Yet from those scattered people emerged a destiny so powerful that it would shape the history of an entire continent. It begins with a prophecy and with a boy who could not walk. Sundiata Keita was born into the Keita clan of the Mandinka people, a child marked by fate and weakness. His mother, Sogolon, was not of royal beauty or strength. She was chosen because a prophecy foretold that her son would become a great king. But when he was born unable to use his legs, the prophecy seemed cruel, a cosmic joke. His father, King Magan Fata, died soon after, leaving the throne in peril. In his absence, the rival queen, Sasuma Berete, mocked Sogolon and her son, ruling through her child and casting Sundiata aside. In a world where strength meant survival, a crippled boy had no place on a throne. But Sundiata was not ordinary. As he grew, so did his will. When his mother was humiliated before the people, he vowed that he would stand, not for pride, but for destiny. One day he ordered a blacksmith to forge an iron rod. Before the eyes of the court, he used it to pull himself upright, trembling, sweating, his arms shaking. The rod bent under the weight of his effort, but he stood. The prophecy had awakened. From that day forward, whispers spread across the kingdom. The boy who could not walk had risen to claim his fate. Soon after, tragedy struck again. Sundiata and his mother were exiled, forced to wander from kingdom to kingdom. Yet exile forged him into a warrior and a leader. He studied the art of politics, war, and alliance. He saw how kingdoms rose and fell, how power was built and lost. He learned not only how to rule, but how to unite. Across West Africa, he gathered allies, hunters, warriors, chieftains, men who had once been enemies. Each saw in him not a boy, but a vision. He did not promise riches. He promised a future where every tribe would stand under one banner. That promise was tested when the Soso king, Sumanguru Kante, rose in power. Sumanguru was a tyrant who ruled through fear and magic, a man said to command spirits and darkness. He enslaved kingdoms, crushed dissent, and spread terror across the land. The people of Mali had suffered long enough. In the silence of exile, Sundiata began to gather his strength for war. The Battle of Kirina would decide the fate of an empire. It was not a battle of soldiers alone, but of faith and destiny. Sundiata faced Sumanguru with courage and a secret weapon, not one of iron, but of knowledge. He had learned that Sumanguru's strength lay in a totem, a source of mystical power. When that totem was destroyed, Sumanguru fled the battlefield, his spell broken, his empire collapsing in fear. The victory was not only military, it was symbolic. The darkness that had ruled the land was shattered. The tribes who had once bowed to tyranny now united under Sundiata's leadership. And so, the Mali Empire was born. But its birth was not built on conquest alone. Sundiata understood that power must be rooted in order, in wisdom, and in unity. He convened a great assembly at a place called Kurukan Fuga, a council of chiefs, elders, and leaders from every tribe that had joined him. Together, they established the Charter of Kurukan Fuga, one of the world's earliest constitutions. It was a code of justice, respect, and governance. It declared the rights of men and women, the protection of slaves, and the sanctity of family and land. At a time when much of the world still lived under feudal cruelty, Mali had birthed law through consensus. With stability came prosperity. The Niger River became the empire's lifeline, its currents carrying goods, people, and ideas. Trade routes stretched across the Sahara, connecting Mali to the Mediterranean, Egypt, and beyond. Salt from the desert flowed south, and gold from Mali flowed north. A trade so vast that it transformed the empire into the wealthiest region on earth. Markets in Timbuktu and Gao glowed with wealth and culture. Merchants from Arabia, Berber traders, and scholars from across Africa came to witness a civilization unlike any other. The gold mines of Bambouk and Bure became the empire's beating heart. Villages turned into cities, fields bloomed. Knowledge flourished. But what made Mali extraordinary was not its riches but its balance, between faith and trade, between power and justice. Sundiata had built a system that valued both spirit and survival. He appointed governors known as Farin to oversee provinces, ensuring peace and collecting taxes. A network of protection kept the trade routes safe, guarded by soldiers loyal not to gold, but to the idea of Mali. In time, the empire became a symbol of African greatness. Travelers from North Africa marveled at its organization. Poets and storytellers carried its legend across continents. Even centuries later, the griots, Mali's oral historians, still sing of Sundiata as the Lion King of Mali, the founder who turned exile into empire, prophecy into power. But beneath this triumph lay the first shadows of a truth that would one day return to haunt Mali, the curse of abundance. Gold had made Mali the envy of nations, but it also made it a target. The more its fame spread, the more outsiders hungered for it. Foreign merchants, neighboring kingdoms, and distant empires began to see Mali not as a partner, but as a treasure to exploit. And within, the unity forged by struggle began to waver as new generations grew distant from the hardships that had once bound them together. Still, for now the Mali Empire stood radiant, a beacon of wealth and wisdom. Its rulers had mastered not only the land but the mind, creating a civilization where trade met intellect and faith guided justice. In a world fractured by war and poverty, Mali was proof that an empire born from dust could rise higher than the stars. Yet history is never satisfied with permanence. Every empire that touches greatness awakens forces that will one day pull it back to the earth. The Mali Empire's rise was nothing short of miraculous, but its golden dawn carried within it the faintest whisper of the night to come. The same river that brought wealth would one day carry away its echoes, and in that silence, the sands of the Sahara would begin their slow, patient work, erasing gold, glory, and all but memory. When Mansa Musa ascended the throne of the Mali Empire, the world could not have imagined that his reign would redefine the meaning of wealth and power for centuries to come. He was not merely a ruler born into privilege. He was a man of vision who understood that true greatness was not only measured in gold, but in how a nation used it to shape the world. Under his rule, Mali did not just grow, it dazzled, it thrived, and it rose to become one of the most extraordinary empires ever recorded in human history. Musa came to power in 1312, at a time when the Mali Empire already stood as a strong and prosperous kingdom forged by the legacy of Sundiata Keita. Yet it was Musa who would take that foundation and elevate it to unthinkable heights. The empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the edges of the Sahara in the north, and deep into the forests of West Africa in the south. Gold flowed from its mines like rivers of sunlight, and salt, the lifeblood of the desert, poured in through trade. But wealth without purpose can destroy even the mightiest of realms, and Musa knew that his empire's riches were both a gift and a test. In his early reign, He focused on stability, ensuring that trade routes remained secure and that justice ruled the land. He strengthened Mali's administration, placing trusted governors, or pharaohs, over each province to maintain order and ensure loyalty. Beneath the surface of Mali's wealth was a deep commitment to learning, religion, and diplomacy, the pillars upon which Musa would build his empire's immortal legacy. He ruled not from arrogance but from faith, seeing himself as a servant of a higher purpose, guided by Islam, yet rooted in African wisdom and tradition. Then came the journey that would change history, his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. It was not only a spiritual duty but a declaration to the world of who he was and what Mali represented. His caravan was unlike anything the world had ever seen. 60,000 men followed him, soldiers, attendants, and slaves dressed in fine silks. 12,000 of them carried gold bars and dust. 80 camels trudged across the desert, each burdened with hundreds of pounds of pure gold. He was accompanied by wives, musicians, and heralds who announced his arrival long before he appeared. When Musa reached Cairo, the Egyptian sultan's court was stunned. Never before had anyone witnessed such wealth. Musa's generosity knew no limits. He gave alms to the poor, gifts to the scholars, and gold to merchants and rulers alike. He spent freely, sometimes lavishly, unaware that his kindness would ripple across continents. So much gold flooded into Cairo's markets that its value plummeted, triggering a financial collapse that lasted for more than a decade. Prices soared, economies trembled, and Europe, hearing the tales of the African king whose wealth could alter nations, began to wonder where this golden land lay. Mali's fame had spread beyond Africa. It had become myth, legend, and obsession. But for Musa, the pilgrimage was not about vanity. It was about transformation. Along his journey, he encountered scholars, architects, and thinkers from across the Islamic world. He brought them back to Mali, not as servants but as teachers. Among them was the renowned architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who would go on to design some of Mali's greatest landmarks, including the Jingareber Mosque of Timbuktu. Musa's empire became a center of learning, architecture, and faith. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Niani glowed with intellectual brilliance, drawing scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. Timbuktu, in particular, became the jewel of his empire. Its universities attracted thinkers, poets, mathematicians, and astronomers. The great Sankore University held thousands of manuscripts on science, medicine, and philosophy. Knowledge flowed as freely as gold, and Musa ensured that learning was revered as much as trade. He financed scholars, built libraries, and created an environment where education became the empire's greatest treasure. The Mali Empire under Mansa Musa was not only rich, it was enlightened, but prosperity has a cost. As Musa's wealth spread across the world, envy and ambition followed. Foreign powers began to take notice. Traders from North Africa and beyond saw opportunity in Mali's riches. The more the empire gave, the more outsiders came seeking to take. Musa's pilgrimage, though a symbol of spiritual devotion, also revealed the empire's vast wealth to a world hungry for gold. Mali's name appeared on European maps for the first time, with a golden crown marking the king who ruled it. To outsiders, he was a mythic figure. To his people, he was a godsend. Yet within his own empire, the seeds of change had already begun to grow. Musa's generosity, though rooted in faith, created imbalances. His gifts enriched some and weakened others. Regional governors who once served loyally began to crave independence. The massive expenditure during the pilgrimage strained Mali's reserves, and though Musa's wealth was beyond measure, even gold could not sustain endless giving. The empire's strength was tied to the man who ruled it, and his vision, while magnificent, was not eternal. In his later years, Musa turned his attention back to his people. He commissioned new mosques, reinforced trade routes, and established systems of justice that reflected both Islamic principles and African traditions. He encouraged agriculture and ensured that Mali's wealth was not hoarded but circulated. Yet even as he built, he could sense the fragility of what he had created. Empires are like gold, beautiful, brilliant, but soft. Without unity, they bend beneath their own weight. When Mansa Musa died sometime around 1337, the empire was at the height of its power, larger, richer, and more influential than ever before. Yet with his passing, something intangible left Mali. His successors inherited an empire of immense wealth but lacked his wisdom and restraint. They had the gold but not the vision. They had the power but not the purpose. And without the guiding hand that once balanced faith with fortune, Mali began to drift. The story of Mansa Musa is one of triumph and tragedy. He turned a kingdom into a symbol of human potential, showing that an African empire could rival, even surpass, the greatest powers of the world. His wealth inspired awe, his faith inspired respect, and his intellect inspired generations. Yet the very brilliance that made him immortal also set the stage for decline. His empire became a legend too great for its own people to carry. Centuries later, historians and economists still try to comprehend the scale of his wealth. Adjusted for modern value, some estimate that Mansa Musa's fortune would exceed $400 billion, more than any monarch, emperor, or billionaire in history. But perhaps his greatest legacy is not in gold at all. It lies in the libraries of Timbuktu, the architectural wonders that still stand, and the stories passed down through centuries of oral tradition. His life proved that greatness is not born of conquest alone, but of vision, faith, and the courage to build something greater than oneself. Yet even as time erases his footprints in the sands of the Sahara, Mansa Musa's name endures, a symbol of what once was and what humanity can become. The empire he left behind would soon face storms it could not endure, challenges from within and without. The Golden Age had reached its peak, and from that summit, there was only one direction left to fall. But for a brief, radiant moment in history, one man and his empire stood above the world, and the earth itself glittered in gold beneath their feet. After the reign of Mansa Musa, the Mali Empire stood as a colossus of wealth and prestige. But beneath its golden surface, invisible cracks had begun to form. Musa's pilgrimage had made Mali famous beyond imagination. Its name echoed from North Africa to the courts of Europe. Yet that fame was a double-edged sword. The world had now seen the treasure that Africa held, and with envy came hunger. The empire that had dazzled the world was now being watched, not with admiration, but with calculation. What had been Musa's glory was soon to become Mali's burden. His death left a void that no successor could truly fill. The weight of an empire so vast demanded a ruler of vision, wisdom, and restraint, qualities that are rarely inherited. Musa's son Magan Farfur took the throne but found himself overwhelmed. The machinery of the empire, once fueled by Musa's discipline, now began to slow. Gold still flowed, the markets still thrived, but the unity that had held Mali together began to erode quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the sands eating away at stone. The first signs of decline appeared not in war, but in whispers. Governors in distant provinces grew restless, sensing that the center was no longer as strong as it once was. The system of governance that Sundiata and Musa had carefully crafted, a balance between loyalty and power, began to tilt. Regional leaders, entrusted with authority, now used it for themselves. Tribute stopped flowing from some territories. The great trade caravans, once symbols of wealth and security, became vulnerable to raids. In the cities, merchants started to hoard their wealth instead of circulating it through the empire's economy. Prosperity was being replaced by self-interest. The trade routes that had once brought riches from the Sahara became lines of vulnerability. Mali's lifeblood was gold and salt, but these were finite veins, and with every caravan that left the empire, the wealth that had once been endless began to thin. The Songhai people, who had long lived under Mali's influence, began to rise in power, especially around the city of Gao. Once loyal to Mali, the Songhai now sensed opportunity. Their leaders watched as Mali's kings squabbled, their armies weakened, and their influence waned. Internal politics became a game of betrayal. After Magan I, a series of rulers took the throne, some through lineage, others through force. None possessed Musa's control. Civil strife broke out as rival factions vied for the crown. Each new ruler promised restoration, but each reign only deepened the divisions. The empire's borders began to shrink. Towns that had once flown the banner of Mali now declared independence or swore loyalty to new powers. The once great kingdom that had stretched across thousands of miles began to fracture into isolated territories. As instability grew, the empire's vast trade network began to unravel. Merchants from North Africa, once eager to trade with Mali, turned toward safer and more reliable routes. The world beyond Mali's borders was changing. The Portuguese had reached the West African coast by sea, bypassing the trans-Saharan trade routes that had made Mali rich. Gold could now flow directly to Europe through new coastal ports, cutting Mali out of the global exchange it had once dominated. The wealth that had defined the empire now began to escape its grasp. But wealth was not the only thing Mali was losing. It was also losing its identity. The intellectual centers of Timbuktu and Gao, once vibrant with scholars and travelers, began to fade. The libraries that had attracted thinkers from across the Islamic world still stood, but the flow of ideas slowed. Many of the empire's most learned men left for safer lands, taking with them manuscripts and knowledge that had once made Mali a beacon of enlightenment. Without leadership to protect and nurture its culture, even wisdom began to scatter. Nature, too, turned against the empire. Drought struck the Sahel and harvests failed. The great Niger River, once a symbol of abundance, became unpredictable. Crops withered, livestock died, and hunger crept into villages that had once overflowed with food. When nature takes from the poor, rebellion brews. When it takes from the wealthy, collapse follows. As famine spread, the loyalty of Mali's people wavered. Soldiers deserted, and local leaders began to rule as if they were independent kings. The once mighty armies of Mali, famed for their discipline and power, could no longer defend the borders. The empire that had once struck fear into its enemies now struggled to defend its own heartland. Invaders began to test its strength. The Tuareg, fierce warriors of the Sahara, raided northern cities. The Mossi from the south pressed against its frontiers. In the east, the Songhai advanced steadily, capturing trade centers that once filled Mali's coffers with gold. The fall was slow, almost graceful, as if the empire refused to admit defeat. The royal court in Niani still pretended that Mali was unshaken, still performed the rituals of kingship, still held audiences and festivals. But the splendor was hollow. The courtiers dressed in silk, yet their voices echoed through halls that grew emptier each year. Gold still adorned the throne, but its glow no longer inspired awe. It reflected loss. There was a cruel irony in Mali's decline. The very thing that had made it strong, its wealth, had become its undoing. The gold that had bought loyalty now bought treachery. The trade that had connected it to the world now connected the world to its downfall. And the fame that had made it legendary had painted a target upon its back. In the midst of this decay, the Songhai Empire rose like a shadow reborn. Under the leadership of Soni Ali, the Songhai struck deep into Mali's territory, capturing the vital city of Timbuktu in 1468. The jewel of Mali's intellect, its crown of scholarship, was gone. With it went the last breath of Mali's golden age. Gao, once a tributary, became the new center of power, and Mali's former glory was absorbed by the very people it had once ruled. By the end of the 15th century, Mali was a shell of its former self. The once sprawling empire had shrunk to a small kingdom struggling to survive against greater powers. Its cities were looted, its libraries abandoned, its roads deserted. The griots still sang the songs of Sundiata and Mansa Musa, but even their voices trembled with sadness. The people of Mali, once rulers of the richest land on earth, were now keepers of memories. Yet even as the empire faded, its legacy endured. The idea of unity, the wisdom of its laws, and the echo of its culture outlasted its fall. The charter of Fuga still lived in the hearts of those who remembered justice. The architecture of its mosques still stood against the desert wind. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, hidden and preserved by brave scholars, still whispered the brilliance of an age when knowledge and wealth walked hand in hand. The decline of Mali was not a single event, but a long, slow surrender to greed, to division, to time itself. It was the story of how greatness, left unguarded, becomes its own enemy. The richest empire on earth did not fall because it was conquered. It fell because it forgot what had made it strong. And so, as the last light of Mali's power dimmed over the horizon, the sands of the Sahara began their quiet work, covering what remained of gold, glory, and pride, until only legends were left to tell the tale. The winds still whisper across the empty plains where kings once rode, where gold once glittered brighter than the sun itself. The Mali Empire's story ends not with destruction, but with disappearance, a vanishing act so complete that even its capital faded into the earth. Was it greed that devoured it, or something deeper hidden in the sands of time? No empire falls without leaving behind a secret, and perhaps Mali's greatest treasure was never its gold, but the truth buried beneath centuries of silence. For now, that truth sleeps beneath the desert, waiting to be unearthed. But as we close this chapter, one question lingers: if the richest empire in history could vanish without a trace, what other forgotten kingdoms lie beneath the dust, waiting to rise again? The winds still whisper across the empty plains where kings once rode, where gold once glittered brighter than the sun itself. The Mali Empire's story ends not with destruction, but with disappearance, a vanishing act so complete that even its capital faded into the earth. Was it greed that devoured it, or something deeper, hidden in the sands of time? No empire falls without leaving behind a secret, and perhaps Mali's greatest treasure was never its gold, but the truth buried beneath centuries of silence. For now, that truth sleeps beneath the desert, waiting to be unearthed. But as we close this chapter, one question lingers: if the richest empire in history could vanish without a trace, what other forgotten kingdoms lie beneath the dust, waiting to rise again?